love. It is often assumed that sexual activity is the most important factor of the Satanic religion, and that willingness to participate in sex orgies is a prerequisite for becoming a Satanist. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, opportunists who have no deeper interest in Satanism than merely the sexual aspects are emphatically discouraged. Satanism advocates sexual freedom, but only in the true sense of the word. Free love, in the Satanic concept, means exactly that: freedom to either be faithful to one person or to indulge your sexual desires with as many others as you feel is necessary to satisfy your particular needs. Satanism does not encourage orgiastic activity or extramarital affairs for those to whom they do not come naturally. For many, it would be very unnatural and detrimental to be unfaithful to their chosen mates. To others, it would be frustrating to be bound sexually to just one person. Each person must decide for himself what form of sexual activity best suits his individual needs. Self-deceitfully forcing yourself to be adulterous or to have sex partners, when not married, just for the sake of proving others, or worse yet, to yourself, that you are emancipated from sexual guilt, is just as wrong, by Satanic standards, as leaving any sexual need unfulfilled because of ingrained feelings of guilt. Many of those who are constantly preoccupied with demonstrating their emancipation from sexual guilt are, in reality, held in even greater sexual bondage than those who simply accept sexual activity as a natural part of life and don't make a big to-do over their sexual freedom. For example, it is an established fact that the nymphomaniac, every man's dream girl and heroine of all earth novels, is not sexually free, but is actually frigid and roves from man to man because she is too inhibited to ever find complete sexual release. Another misconception is the idea that ability to engage in group sexual activity is the indicative of sexual freedom. All contemporary free sex groups have one thing in common: discouragement of fetishistic or deviant activity. Actually, the most forced examples of non-fetishistic sexual activity, thinly disguised as freedom, have a common format. Each of the participants in an orgy removes all clothing, following the example set forth by one, and mechanically fornicate, also following the leader's example. None of the performers consider that their emancipated form of sex might be regarded as regimented and infantile by non-members who fail to equate uniformity with freedom. The Satanist realizes that if he is to be a sexual connoisseur and truly free from all sexual guilt, he cannot be stifled by the so-called sexual revolutionists any more than he can by the prudery of his guilt-ridden society. These free sex clubs miss the whole point of sexual freedom. Unless sexual activity can be expressed on an individual basis, which includes personal fetishes, there is absolutely no purpose in belonging to a sexual freedom organization. Satanism condones any type of sexual activity which properly satisfies your individual desires, be it heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or even asexual, if you choose. Satanism also sanctions any fetish or deviation which will enhance your sex life, so long as it involves no one who does not wish to be involved. The prevalence of deviant and or fetishistic behavior in our society would stagger the imagination of the sexually naive. there are more sexual variants than the unenlightened individual can perceive: transvestism, sadism, masochism, urolagnia, exhibitionism, to name only a few of the more predominant. Everyone has some form of fetish, but because they are unaware of the preponderance of fetishistic activity in our society, they feel they are depraved. If they submit to their unnatural yearnings, even the asexual has a deviation, his asexuality. It is far more abnormal to have a lack of sexual desire unless illness or old age, or another valid reason has caused the wane, than it is to be sexually promiscuous. However, if a Satanist chooses sexual sublimation above overt sexual expression, that is entirely his own affair. In many cases of sexual sublimation or asexuality, any attempt to emancipate himself sexually would prove devastating to the asexual. Asexuals are invariably sexually sublimated by their jobs or hobbies. All the energy and driving interest which would normally be devoted to sexual activity is channeled into other pastimes or into their chosen occupations. If a person favors other interests over sexual activity, it is his right, and no one is justified in condemning him for it. However, the person should at least recognize the fact that this is a sexual sublimation. Because of lack of opportunity for expression, many secret sexual desires never progress beyond the fantasy stage. Lack of release often leads to compulsion, and, therefore, a great number of people devise undetectable methods of giving vent to their urges. Just because most fetishistic activity is not outwardly apparent, the sexually unsophisticated should not delude himself into thinking it does not exist. To cite examples of the ingenious techniques used, the male transvestite will indulge in his fetish by wearing feminine undergarments while going about his daily activities, or the masochistic woman might wear a rubber girdle several sizes too small, so she may derive sexual pleasure from her fetishistic discomfort throughout the day, with no one the wiser. These illustrations are far tamer and more prevalent examples than others which could have been given. Satanism encourages any form of sexual expression you may desire, so long as it hurts no one else. This statement must be qualified, to avoid misinterpretation, by not hurting another. This does not include the unintentional hurt felt by those who might not agree with your views on sex, because of their anxieties regarding sexual morality. Naturally, you should avoid offending others who mean a great deal to you, such as prudish friends and relatives. However, if you earnestly endeavor to escape hurting them, and despite your efforts they accidentally find out, you cannot be held responsible, and therefore should feel no guilt as a result of either your sexual convictions, or their being hurt because of those convictions. If you are in constant fear of offending the prudish by your attitude towards sex, then there is no sense in trying to emancipate yourself from sexual guilt. However, no purpose is served by flaunting your permissiveness. The other exception to the rule regards feelings with masochists. The masochist derives pleasure from being hurt, so denying the masochist his pleasure through pain hurts him just as much as actual physical pain hurts the non-masochist. The story of the truly cruel sadist illustrates this point. The masochist says to the sadist, "Beat me," to which the merciless sadist replies, "No." If a person wants to be hurt and enjoys suffering, then there is no reason not to indulge him in his want. The term sadist in popular usage describes one who obtains pleasure from indiscriminate brutality. Actually, though, a true sadist is selective. He carefully chooses from the vast reserve of appropriate victims, and takes great delight in getting those who thrive on misery the fulfillment of their desires. The well-adjusted sadist is Epicurean in selecting those on whom his energies will be well spent. If a person is healthy enough to admit he is a masochist and enjoys being enslaved and whipped, the real sadist is glad to oblige. Aside from the foregoing exceptions, the Satanist would not intentionally hurt others by violating their sexual rights. If you attempt to impose your sexual desires upon others who do not welcome your advances, you are infringing upon their sexual freedom. Therefore, Satanism does not advocate rape, child molesting, sexual defilement of animals, or any other form of sexual activity which entails the participation of those who are unwilling or whose innocence or naivete would allow them to be intimidated or misguided into doing something against their wishes. If all parties involved are mature adults who willingly take full responsibility for their actions and voluntarily engage in a given form of sexual expression, even if it is generally considered taboo, then there is no reason for them to repress their sexual inclinations. If you are aware of all the implications, advantages, and disadvantages, and are certain your actions will hurt no one who does not wish or deserve to be hurt, you have no cause to suppress your sexual preferences. Just as no two people are exactly the same in their choice of diet or have the same capacity for the consumption of food, sexual tastes and appetites vary from person to person. No person or society has the right to set limitations on the sexual standards or the frequency of sexual activity of another. Proper sexual conduct can only be judged within the context of each individual situation. Therefore, what one person considers sexually correct and moral may be frustrating to another. The reverse is also true. One person may have great sexual prowess, but it is unjust for him to belittle another whose sexual capacity may not equal his own, and inconsiderate for him to impose himself upon the other person, that is, the man who has a voracious sexual appetite, but whose wife's sexual needs do not match his own. It is unfair for him to expect her to enthusiastically respond to his overtures, but she must display the same degree of thoughtfulness. In the instances when she does not feel great passion, she should either passively, but pleasantly, accept him sexually, or raise no complaint if he chooses to find his needed release elsewhere, including autoerotic practices. The ideal relationship is one in which the people are deeply in love with one another and are sexually compatible. However, perfect relationships are relatively uncommon. It is important to point out here that spiritual love and sexual love can, but do not necessarily, go hand in hand. If there is a certain amount of sexual compatibility, often it is limited, and some, but not all, of the sexual desires will be fulfilled. There is no greater sexual pleasure than that derived from association with someone you deeply love. If you are sexually well suited, if you are not suited to one another sexually, though, it must be stressed that lack of sexual compatibility does not indicate lack of spiritual love. One can, and often does, exist without the other. As a matter of fact, often one member of a couple will resort to outside sexual activity because he deeply loves his mate, and wishes to avoid hurting or imposing upon his loved one. Deep spiritual love is enriched by sexual love, and it is certainly a necessary ingredient for any satisfactory relationship, but because of differing sexual predilections, outside sexual activity or masturbation sometimes provides a needed supplement. Masturbation, considered a sexual taboo by many people, creates a guilt problem not easily dealt with. Much emphasis must be placed on this subject, as it constitutes an extremely important ingredient of many a successful magical working. Ever since the Judeo-Christian Bible described the sin of Onat General 38:710, man has considered the seriousness and consequences of the solitary vice. Even though modern sexologists have explained the sin of Onat as simply coitus interruptus, the damage has been done through centuries of theological misinterpretation. Aside from actual sex crimes, masturbation is one of the most frowned upon sexual acts. During the last century, innumerable texts were written describing the horrific consequences of masturbation. Practically all physical or mental illnesses were attributed to the evils of masturbation: pallor of the complexion, shortness of breath, furtive expression, sunken chest, nervousness, pimples, and loss of appetite are only a few of the many characteristics supposedly resulting from masturbation. Total physical and mental collapse was assured if one did not heed the warnings in those handbooks for young men. The lurid descriptions in such texts would be almost humorous, were it not for the unhappy fact that even though contemporary sexologists, doctors, writers, etc. have done much to remove the stigma of masturbation, the deep-seated guilt induced by the nonsense in those sexual primers have been only partially erased. A large percentage of people, especially those over 40, cannot emotionally accept the fact that masturbation is natural and healthy, even if they now accept it intellectually, and they, in turn, relate their repugnance, often subconsciously, to their children. It was thought that one would go insane if, despite numerous admonitions, his autoerotic practices persisted. This preposterous myth grew from reports of widespread masturbation by the inmates of mental institutions. It was assumed that since almost all incurably insane people masturbated, it was their masturbation that had driven them mad. No one ever stopped to consider the lack of sexual partners of the opposite sex and the freedom from inhibition, which is a characteristic of extreme insanity, were the real reasons for the masturbatory practices of the insane. Many people would rather have their mates seek outside sexual activity than perform autoerotic acts because of their own guilt feelings, the mate's repugnance towards having them engaged in masturbation, or the fear of their mate's repugnance, although in a surprising number of cases, the vicarious thrill is obtained from the knowledge that the mate is having sexual experiences with outsiders, although this is seldom admitted. If stimulation is provided by envisioning one's mate sexually engaged with others, this should be brought out into the open where both parties may gain from such activities. However, if the prohibition of masturbation is only due to guilt feelings on the part of one or both parties, they should make every attempt to erase those guilts, or utilize them. Many relationships might be saved from destruction if the people involved did not feel guilt about performing the natural act of masturbation. Masturbation is regarded as evil because it produces pleasure derived from intentionally fondling a forbidden area of the body by one's own hand. The guilt feelings accompanying most sexual acts can be assuaged by the religiously acceptable contention that your sensual delights are necessary to produce offspring, even though you cautiously watch the calendar for the safe days. You cannot, however, placate yourself with this rationale while engaging in masturbatory practices. No matter what you've been told about the Immaculate Conception, even if blind faith allows you to swallow this absurdity, you know full well if you are to produce a child, there must be sexual contact with a person of the opposite sex. If you feel guilty for committing the original sin, you certainly will feel even deeper guilt for performing a sex act only for self-gratification, with no intention of creating children. The Satanist fully realizes why religionists declare masturbation to be sinful. Like all other natural acts, people will do it, no matter how severely reprimanded. Causing guilt is an important facet of their malicious scheme to obligate people to atone for sins by paying the mortgages on temples of abstinence. Even if a person is no longer struggling under the burden of religiously induced guilt or thinks he isn't, modern man still feels shame if he yields to his masturbatory desires. A man may feel robbed of his masculinity if he satisfies himself autoerotically rather than engaging in the competitive game of woman chasing. A woman may satisfy herself sexually but yearns for the ego gratification that comes from the sport of seduction. Neither the quasi-Casanova nor bogus vamp feels adequate when reduced to masturbation for sexual gratification. Both would prefer even an inadequate partner. Satanically speaking, though, it is far better to engage in a perfect fantasy than to cooperate in an unrewarding experience with another person. With masturbation, you are in complete control of the situation. To illustrate the undebatable fact that masturbation is an entirely normal and healthy practice, it is performed by all members of the animal kingdom. Human children will also follow their instinctive masturbatory desires, unless they have been scolded for it by their indignant parents, who were undoubtedly berated for it by their parents, and so on down the retrocedent line. It is unfortunate, but true, that the sexual guilt of parents will immutably be passed on to their children. In order to save our children from the ill-fated sexual destiny of our parents, grandparents, and possibly ourselves, the perverted moral code of the past must be exposed for what it is, a pragmatically organized set of rules which, if rigidly obeyed, would destroy us, unless we emancipate ourselves from the ridiculous sexual standards of our present society, including the so-called sexual revolution. The neuroses caused by those stifling regulations will persist. Adherence to the sensible and humanistic morality of Satanism can, and will, evolve society in which our children can grow up healthy and without the devastating moral encumbrances of our existing sick society. Not all vampires suck blood. Satanism represents responsibility to the responsible, instead of concern for psychic vampires. Many people who walk the earth practice the fine art of making others feel responsible, and even indebted to them, without cause. Satanism observes these leeches in their true Light-sighted vampires are individuals who drain others of their vital energy. This type of person can be found in all avenues of society. They fill no useful purpose in our lives, and are neither love objects nor true friends. Yet we feel responsible to the sighted vampire without knowing why. If you think you may be the victim of such a person, there are a few simple rules which will help you form a decision. Is there a person you often call or visit, even though you really don't want to, because you know you will feel guilty if you don't? Or do you find yourself constantly doing favors for one who doesn't come forward and ask, but hints? Often the sighted vampire will use reverse psychology, saying, "Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that," and you, in turn, insist upon doing it. The psychic vampire never demands anything of you. That would be far too presumptuous. They simply let their wishes be known in subtle ways which will prevent them from being considered pests. They wouldn't think of imposing and are always content and willingly accept their lot, without the slightest complaint. Outwardly, their sins are not of commission, but of omission. It's what they don't say, not what they do say, that makes you feel you must account to them. They are much too crafty to make overt demands upon you, because they know you would resent it, and would have a tangible and legitimate reason for denying them. A large percentage of these people have special attributes which make their dependence upon you more feasible and much more effective. Many sighted vampires are invalids or pretend to be or are mentally or emotionally disturbed. Others might feign ignorance or incompetence, so you will, out of pity, or more often, exasperation, do things for them. The traditional way to banish a demon or elemental is to recognize it for what it is, and exorcise it. Recognition of these modern-day demons and their methods is the only antidote for their devastating hold over you. Most people accept these passively vicious individuals at face value only because their insidious maneuvers have never been pointed out to them. They merely accept these poor souls as being less fortunate than themselves, and feel they must help them however they can. It is this misdirected sense of responsibility or unfounded sense of guilt which nourishes the altruisms upon which these parasites feast. The psychic vampire is allowed to exist because he cleverly chooses conscientious, responsible people for his victims, people with great dedication to their moral obligations. In some cases we are vampirized by groups of people, as well as individuals. Every fund-raising organization, be it a charitable foundation, community council, religious or fraternal association, etc., carefully selects a person who is adept at making others feel guilty for its chairman or coordinator. It is the job of this chairman to intimidate us into opening first our hearts, and then our wallets, to the recipient of their goodwill, never mentioning that, in many cases, their time is not unselfishly donated, but that they are drawing a fat salary for their noble deeds. They are masters at playing upon the sympathy and consideration of responsible people. How often we see little children who have been sent forth by these self-righteous Fagans to painlessly extract donations from the kindly. Who can resist the innocent charm of a child? There are, of course, people who are not happy unless they are giving, but many of us do not fit into this category. Unfortunately, We are often put upon to do things we do not genuinely feel should be required of us. A conscientious person finds it very difficult to decide between voluntary and imposed charity. He wants to do what is right and just, and finds it perplexing trying to decide exactly who he should help and what degree of aid should rightfully be expected of him. Each person must decide for himself what his obligations are to his respective friends, family, and community. Before donating his time and money to those outside his immediate family and close circle of friends, he must decide what he can afford, without depriving those closest to him. When taking these things into consideration, he must be certain to include himself among those who mean most to him. He must carefully evaluate the validity of the request and the personality or motives of the person asking it of him. It is extremely difficult for a person to learn to say no when all his life he has said yes. But unless he wants to be constantly taken advantage of, he must learn to say no when circumstances justify doing so. If you allow them, psychic vampires will gradually infiltrate your everyday life until you have no privacy left, and your constant feeling of concern for them will deplete you of all ambition. The psychic vampire will always select the person who is relatively content and satisfied with his life, the person who is happily married, pleased with his job, and generally well adjusted to the world around him. To feed upon the very fact that the psychic vampire chooses to victimize a happy person shows that he is lacking all the things his victim has. He will do everything he can to stir up trouble and disharmony between his victim and those people he holds dear. Therefore, be wary of anyone who seems to have no real friends and no apparent interest in life except you. He will usually tell you he is very selective in his choice of friends, or doesn't make friends easily because of the high standards he sets for his companions. 2. Acquire and keep friends. One must be willing to give of himself, something of which the psychic vampire is incapable, but he will hasten to add that you fulfill every requirement and are truly an outstanding exception among men. You are one of the very few worthy of his friendship. Lest you confuse desperate love, which is a very selfish thing, with psychic vampirism, the vast difference between the two must be clarified. The only way to determine if you are being vampirized is to weigh what you give the person compared to what they give you in return. You may, at times, become annoyed with the obligations put upon you by a loved one, a close friend, or even an employer. But before you label them psychic vampires, you must ask yourself, what am I getting in return? If your spouse or lover insists that you call them frequently, but you also require them to account to you for their time spent away from you, you must realize this is a give and take situation. Or, if a friend is in the habit of calling upon you for help at an opportune moment, but you similarly depend upon them to give your immediate needs priority, you must regard it as a fair exchange. If your employer asks you to do a little more than is normally expected of you in your particular position, but will overlook the occasional tardiness or will give you time off when you need it, you certainly have no cause for complaint and need not feel he is taking advantage of you. You are, however, being vampirized if you are incessantly called upon or expected to do favors for someone who, when you need a favor, always happens to have other pressing obligations. Many psychic vampires will give you material things for the express purpose of making you feel you owe them something in return, thereby binding you to them. The difference between your giving and theirs is that your return payment must come in a non-material form. They want you to feel obligated to them, and would be very disappointed and even resentful if you attempted to repay them with material objects. In essence, you have sold your soul to them, and they'll constantly remind you of your duty to them. By not reminding you, being purely satanic, the only way to deal with a psychic vampire is to play dumb and act as though they are genuinely altruistic and really expect nothing in return. Teach them a lesson by graciously taking what they give you, thanking them loudly enough for all to hear, and walking away. In this way you come out the victor. What can they say? And when you are inevitably expected to repay their generosity, this is the hard part. You say no, but again, graciously, when they feel you falling from their clutches, two things will happen. First, they will act crushed, hoping your old feeling of duty and sympathy will return, and when and if it doesn't, they will show their true colors and will become angry and vindictive. Once you have moved them to this point, you can play a role of the injured party. After all, you've done nothing wrong, you just happened to have had pressing obligations when they needed you, and since nothing was expected in return for their gifts, there should be no hard feelings. Generally, the psychic vampire will realize his methods have been discovered and will not press the issue. He will not continue to waste his time with you, but will move on to his next unsuspecting victim. There are times, however, when the psychic vampire will not release his hold so easily, and will do everything possible to torment you. They have plenty of time for this because, when once rejected, they will neglect all else, what little else they have, that is to devote their every waking moment to planning the revenge to which they feel they are entitled. For this reason, it is best to avoid a relationship with this kind of person in the first place. Their adulation and dependence upon you may, at first, be very flattering, and their material gifts very attractive. But you will eventually find yourself paying for them many times over. Don't waste your time with people who will ultimately destroy you, but concentrate instead on those who will appreciate your responsibility to them, and, likewise, feel responsible to you. And if you are a psychic vampire, take heed. Beware of Satanist. He is ready and willing to gleefully drive the proverbial stake through your heart. Indulgence, not compulsion. The highest plateau of human development is the awareness of the flesh. Satanism encourages its followers to indulge in their natural desires. Only by doing so can you be a completely satisfied person with no frustrations which can be harmful to yourself and others around you. Therefore, the most simplified description of the Satanic belief is indulgence instead of abstinence. People often mistake compulsion for indulgence, but there is a world of difference between the two. A compulsion is never created by indulging, but by not being able to indulge. By making something taboo, it only serves to intensify the desire. Everyone likes to do the things they have been told not to. Forbidden fruits are sweetest. Webster's Encyclopedic Dictionary defines indulgence thusly: to give oneself up to not to restrain or oppose, to give free course to gratify by compliance, to yield to. The dictionary definition of compulsion is the act of compelling or driving by a force, physical or moral, constraint of the will, compulsory, obligatory. In other words, indulgence implies choice, whereas compulsion indicates the lack of choice. Love. It is often assumed that sexual activity is the most important factor of the Satanic religion, and that willingness to participate in sex orgies is a prerequisite for becoming a Satanist. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, opportunists who have no deeper interest in Satanism than merely the sexual aspects are emphatically discouraged. Satanism advocates sexual freedom, but only in the true sense of the word. Free love, in the Satanic concept, means exactly that: freedom to either be faithful to one person or to indulge your sexual desires with as many others as you feel is necessary to satisfy your particular needs. Satanism does not encourage orgiastic activity or extramarital affairs for those to whom they do not come naturally. For many, it would be very unnatural and detrimental to be unfaithful to their chosen mates, to others.